Japanese democracy is experiencing an interesting turn of events. Right now, Japan's ruling coalition is trying to push through bills that most opposition parties reject. And the Prime Minister is doing all this while lawmakers within her own party question her policy priorities. As a result, opposition parties are ditching parliament. The tensions within the ruling coalition are increasing, and Japan literally is trying to speedrun one of its most crucial policies in a week. So this raises a question. Is Japan's parliamentary system still functioning as it should, or are we witnessing a fundamental shift? In this video, we'll look at how Prime Minister Takaichi's coalition reached this point, what tools it has to push through, where public opinion actually stands on its key policies, and why the government's own coalition, not the public, is the main source of friction right now. Everything in this video reflects what's known as the July 7th, so some details may have changed by the time you're watching this. And before we continue, this is Japan Yuntaku, and on this channel, we use government documents, research papers, and news reporting to understand what's actually happening in Japanese politics. To understand the current standoff, we need to go back to October 2025. This is when the Komeito, the LDP's coalition partner of 26 years, walked away. The split came down to a dispute over political funding regulations. With Komeito gone, Takaichi needed a new partner to become Prime Minister, which ended up being the Japan Innovation Party, or the JIP. But the JIP's support came with conditions. They submitted 12 main proposals to the LDP, and there are two policies that the opposition parties adamantly oppose: cutting the number of lower house seats by 10% or 45 seats, and creating a secondary capital in Osaka. Despite LDP lawmakers being hesitant about some of the JIP's proposal, Prime Minister Takaichi went through with the coalition to secure premiership. Opposition parties were discussing a potential three-party coalition to secure a majority in parliament, so Takaichi accepted the JIP's terms. The bet paid off electorally. With Prime Minister Takaichi's popularity at unprecedented levels, in the February 2026 snap election, the LDP won 316 of 465 lower house seats, its best result since the party's founding, giving the ruling bloc a two-thirds supermajority. Now that the LDP secured a supermajority with the JIP is pushing Prime Minister Takaichi to fulfill her promise. So let's return to the two JIP proposals and why these are controversial. The seat reduction bill is where the tension is sharpest. Under the current proposal, 45 seats from the lower house would be cut, which is a 10% decrease, unless a cross-party panel reaches a different agreement on electoral reform within a year. Since proportional representation is how smaller parties typically win representation, those parties would be hit the hardest, and most of them oppose the bill exactly for that reason. The secondary capital policy isn't popular with LDP lawmakers either, because it falls into the long-standing Osaka Metropolis plan. If approved in a local referendum, that would dismantle Osaka City and reorganize it into a Tokyo-style special ward, ending the current city assembly and, with it, city residents' distinct voice in their own government. The LDP's Osaka branch has fought the same plan through two earlier referendums, back in 2015 and 2020, so a third attempt puts the party's local branch in an awkward position again. Additionally, the LDP created a national council to debate food consumption tax reform, but staffed its own chair role with its own tax policy chief. The resulting proposal lined up almost exactly with what Takaichi had already promised. This fueled the opposition's resentment towards Takaichi's governance, since the opposition's own proposals weren't considered for the final plan. Additionally, there is continued resistance within the LDP itself. On June 25th, a senior member of the party's tax commission resigned, reportedly over the opposition to the consumption tax cut. Rather than wait for opposition agreement, the ruling bloc sets its own schedule in the lower house to begin deliberating the seat reduction bill, alongside the secondary capital bill. Opposition parties responded by boycotting plenary sessions and committee meetings altogether. Proceeding without cross-party agreement is not unprecedented in Diet, and the ruling bloc can easily push through the lower house with its supermajority. The remaining problem is that these bills still have to clear the upper house, where the ruling bloc does not have a majority. The standoff has reached a point where lower house speaker Eisuke Mori has stepped in directly. On July 1st, Mori met with the secretary generals of all 7 ruling and opposition parties, calling for a spirit of mutual concession and asking the ruling bloc for further effort toward normalizing the Diet. Opposition parties are specifically demanding an intensive budget committee session and a formal party's leaders debate with Takaichi in attendance, something she recently agreed to schedule, but the Diet session ends on July 17th. Despite Modi's appeal, the lower house went ahead with the committee deliberations on both bills that same day, and the opposition again did not attend. Mori, who is also part of the Aso faction, has pushed since taking office to prioritize the imperial household law, which would secure a male imperial lineage by re-adopting former royal branches. On July 2nd, the LDP Secretary General went a step further, telling opposition parties that the party would pause debate on seat reduction and secondary capital bills to make room for it. This alarmed the JIP, whose leader Hirofumi Yoshimura insisted the coalition pass all three bills, including the imperial law revision, before the session closes, putting further pressure on Takaichi to hold her coalition together. That pressure came to a head on July 7th, when Prime Minister Takaichi and the JIP leader Yoshimura met directly to decide the bill's fate. The two agreed to postpone the seat reduction bill, rather than force a vote before July 17th, though it remains unclear whether it will return in an extraordinary Diet session in the fall or wait for the next ordinary session in 2027. Even so, it's worth understanding the tools the government has on the table but chose not to use. Because this is a special Diet session, convened after February's snap election, it can be extended up to twice under the Diet law, unlike an ordinary session, which allows only one extension. That allows a ruling coalition to simply extend the session into late July to keep working through its agenda, as imperial household law may require more time for discussion. Separately, under Article 59 of the Constitution, if the House of Councillors fail to take final action on a bill within 60 days of receiving it, the House of Representatives can treat that inaction as a rejection. The bill can then become law if the lower house repasses it by a 2/3 majority. This matters because the ruling coalition holds exactly that 2/3 threshold in the lower house. Using it required extending the current session to add roughly 60 more days to run out the clock on the upper house. Choosing to postpone the bill instead suggests the government wasn't willing to pay the political cost of forcing it through. That decision has nothing to do with public opposition, since the public actually supports most of what's being shelved. This is the part that complicates the current situation in Japanese politics, and actually works against the opposition parties. Let's start with the seat cuts. A June Jiji Press poll found that 53.4% of respondents supported the reduction in concentrated and proportional representation. The secondary capital plan tracks similarly. Although a bit outdated, an October 2025 Nikkei poll found 67% approval of the concept. The food consumption tax cut tells a similar story on public support. 49% in favor of Takaichi's 1% proposal versus 45% opposed, in a late June 2036 Nikkei and TV Tokyo poll. So on all three of the government's headline policies, the public is broadly supportive, or at worst, evenly split. The resistance is coming from elsewhere, from opposition parties who see the seat cuts as an attack on their own survival, from LDP members uneasy about the secondary capital bill, and from fiscal hawks inside the ruling party worried about how to fund the tax cut. In other words, this is less a story of an unpopular government forcing through an unpopular agenda, and more one of a government whose own party, and the lawmakers it needs to work with, are more resistant to its policies than the public is. Underneath all of this is another significant yet simple problem. The LDP and JIP do not fully agree on policy, and the JIP currently has the leverage. The seat reduction and secondary capital bills were the JIP's core demands, not the LDP's. Many LDP members were uneasy with both, but the party pushed through anyway, before the seat reduction bill was ultimately postponed. In that sense, the JIP is acting more like a Takaichi faction rather than some members of our own political party. That dependence is why Taro Asuo, vice president of the LDP, has kept the channel open to the DPFP as a possible alternative partner, meeting DPFP leader Yuichiro Tamaki directly in late June. Tamaki has not agreed to anything. He has pointed to the ruling bloc's forced handling of the two JIP bills as a reason enough to stay out for now. Of the currently debated legislation, Asuo is the one most personally invested in revising the imperial household laws to secure a male lineage, having pushed for it through months of negotiations. His faction, the only one left standing in the LDP after the others dissolved in the funding scandal, was decisive in getting Takaichi elected party president back in October 2025. That gives him real leverage over her, and with senior LDP figures already floating the DPFP as a backup coalition partner, his continued goodwill toward the coalition with the JIP is not something Takaichi can simply assume. With that said, a coalition with the DPFP is probably unlikely, as the DPFP and the LDP would have to negotiate and compromise on voting districts, something that a growing party like the DPFP isn't willing to risk. Given everything that is occurring, what makes the current moment worth watching is how these pieces are stacking together, and how little of the resistance is coming from the public. A ruling coalition with a historic two-thirds supermajority holds the constitutional tool to override the opposition on bills that voters largely support, using a legislative schedule set without the opposition's input. Yet neither the LDP nor the JIP ended up using it, at least not yet. Supporters of the government argue that the ruling bloc earned its legitimacy at the ballot box and its policies poll well. If anything, from their point of view, the opposition lawmakers are being unreasonable. Critics argue that leaning on procedural tools to bypass genuine deliberation, even on popular policies, erodes trust. If the ruling coalition continues on its current path, it risks burning bridges with the DPFP and the Sanseto, two parties that have co-sponsored bills with the LDP and JIP before. In the end, the ruling coalition chose to postpone the seat reduction bill rather than force it through. That means the coalition backed down before the opposition or the public ever forced its hand, which suggests the real pressure point in the standoff may have been within the LDP-JIP coalition. So what do you think? Should Prime Minister Takaichi ditch the JIP coalition in the long run to satisfy her own party and work with other parties such as the DPFP and Sanseto, or should she stick with the JIP? Let me know in the comments below. I plan to review bills being discussed in Parliament in future videos such as flag desecration and emergency clause debates, so don't forget to like the video if you learned something new, and subscribe to learn more about Japanese politics.